Roads? Where we're going, we don't need roads.
Hello and welcome back to this year's Heritage Open Day video series, looking at the Preston Brook Tunnel over its 250 years of existence. Although it had been completed in 1775, the tunnel wouldn't come into its own for another 2 years when the Trent and Mersey Canal was open end to end. Other canals quickly followed, but for nearly 30 years the route via Preston Brook Tunnel was the only access by canal for cargo coming north, and even after other canals opened, it still dominated the route cargo took. The years from the opening of the tunnel to the turn of the century were tumultuous. The American War of Independence broke out 6 months after the tunnel opened, and Britain went to war with France as well in the Bourbon War. The knock-on effect of these was to put a serious crimp in the transatlantic slave trade and make it even more topical than ever in British society. Meanwhile, the East India Company was making more strides into Asia and setting the stage for the Opium Wars to come, and the French Revolution caused further distress as radicalism spread over the Channel and gave Napoleon ideas.
I have a cunning plan to solve the problem.
And Preston Brook helped it all. The canals are not one size fits all, and different canals could accommodate different sized boats. The Bridgewater Canal is a broad canal, as are its neighbours the Leeds and Liverpool and the Rochdale Canal, but the Trent and Mersey Canal is narrow. Because of this, and because of the little snafu on the tunnel width, Preston Brook became a major transshipment hub. Cargo brought from the Midlands in narrowboats was transshipped into barges that headed up to Manchester and Liverpool, and cargo from the cities was sent back to the Midlands on the narrowboats' return journey. It was mostly the narrowboats that passed through the tunnel, around 70 feet long and 7 feet wide. Most of them were much as we still see today, but some were a little more draughty. There were no engines in boats back then, and their motive power was of an equine of some description. Of course, this was a problem when it came to the tunnel and its siblings, as there was no towpath for the horse to walk along. This meant that the horse would be disconnected from his boat and taken over the top of the hill by one of the crew, while the others had to leg through. Depending on the length of the legs of the crew, a wingboard might be put out so the crew could reach the tunnel wall. Then the boat would be carefully manoeuvred into the tunnel mouth, and the chosen crew would lie on their backs and walk the boat through against the tunnel wall, step by step. For Preston Brook, this took about 40 minutes. Make no mistake, this is a dangerous job. In tunnels like Preston Brook, where you need a man either side of the boat, you are not only hanging precariously over the water by the light of a candle, but you have to get into step with your mate on the opposite wall. One step out of sync and the boat can move closer or further from the tunnel wall, and once a man was in the water, he was at risk of being crushed by his own boat. The clothing, too, of the time was mostly woolen, which rapidly becomes waterlogged and heavy, and many boatmen couldn't swim. Our tunnel managed to go for 16 years before a fatal accident occurred, made even more poignant in that he remains unidentified to this day. What had probably happened was his body was dropped off at the wharf and the boat carried on after collecting a replacement crew. Wharfmen organised transport to the churchyard, but when the parish clerk came to record the man's name, it was realised that no one knew, and the boat was too far gone to find out, if her crew even knew it at all, as it was quite common for a man to only be known by a nickname rather than the one he was baptised with. Another boatman drowned the following year. We're fairly certain that this young man was a boatman from Runcorn, who left a wife and children. Quite quickly, Preston Brook developed its own team of professional leggers. These men were self-employed and could be booked by word of mouth from the wharf. The Preston Brook leggers were something of an anomaly on the canal system, as they were fairly sober, sensible men who offered a calm, professional service at quite a reasonable rate. Some captains saved a little money by paying members of their own crew to leg instead, and, unlike many locations on the early canals, the Preston Brook leggers didn't cause a fuss if their services were unwanted. The tunnel being less than 14 feet wide meant that boats could only pass through one direction at a time, and although they were only supposed to enter the tunnel at set times, the company was shrewd enough to ensure there were tunnel keepers at either end to try and maintain order. The Preston Brook innkeepers lived literally on top of the tunnel, with a good clear view of the canal from the windows. You can see where the windows were in this photo, and that brings us to the next chapter in the tunnel story. Steam tugs were not a new concept to the canal or the tunnel. One was brought up to perform for the Bridgewater Trust in 1841, and having performed so admirably with 6 loaded barges that even they had to grudgingly admit she was a success, she was brought to the tunnel to see if she would be the answer to the Trent and Mersey Company's increasing traffic problem. Her creator, a man named Peter Taylor, was cautious. Unwilling to disappoint his potential buyers, he nonetheless refused to take more than 2 of the waiting boats in tow and banked the fire down as much as he dared. The passage was a success, the smoke in the tunnel was negligible, and the whole journey took 26 minutes. The audience wasn't satisfied, however, and asked that he step it up. Stoking the fire and taking a 3rd boat in tow, she made her way back into the tunnel. The return journey only took 16 minutes, but this was rather overshadowed by the collapse of the steerer through smoke inhalation. Mr. Taylor, probably quite aware of exactly the sort of exhaust his boat was about to produce, had quietly asked his steerer to hunker down as low as he could, but for reasons known only to himself, the steerer did not, and keeled over as they neared the end. Although the newspaper report was relatively blasé, saying that it was entirely the steerer's own fault, and that none of the other passengers felt serious inconvenience from the smoke, it was a very real obstacle. Mr. Taylor gave the obvious solution: reopen original construction shafts for ventilation. He hastily added that they didn't need to reopen all 12, just a couple, and when that still didn't lighten the mood, he suggested that they simply use an unmanned tug with a guide wire and just don't have anyone in the tunnel at all. History doesn't relate what the leggers thought of this threat to their livelihood, although an apocryphal story says that, as the tug was being unhitched, one man made a point of loudly proclaiming that the tunnel had perfectly good leggers who moved more boats than the tug without costing the company a penny. One of the smartly suited men on the tug retorted back that it was time they cost the company. The original man snapped it was the boatman's time that was lost, and gestured to the waiting boats added that the company didn't have a problem with wasting that. Despite the success of the trial, the idea was quietly shelved again, but by 1864 the tunnels were causing too much of a problem to be left to leggers alone. In autumn 1864, a tug was brought up to work the tunnel for a month, and the company was so pleased that they ordered 3 more. The leggers were disbanded and joined the ranks of general labourers on the canal and wharf side, and the tug started to work in earnest at all 3 tunnels. Almost immediately complaints started filtering through to the company engineers of tugmen being affected by the smoke, but these were ignored. It wasn't until 3 months in, when one of the tugs came out of the tunnel mostly unaided because her crew were unconscious, that the company decided they had to do something, and ordered that 4 shafts be opened. The exact details of what happened next are rather unclear, but the end result was that one of the leggers who had lost his job to the tugs now lost his life to their smoke. Peter Corley was about 56 and had been a legger for about a decade, taking over from his father. When the contractor for the shafts needed labour, Peter joined the workforce. The process was being superintended by James Billington, a practical man with 30 years' experience as a mason for the company, and he was under pressure from them to get the job done quickly. 2 smaller shafts had been completed at either end of the tunnel already, but the main ones were causing trouble. Corley and his colleague Wainwright hitched the Preston Brook icebreaker to the back of the train of boats going into the tunnel, with instructions to cast off at the worksite and bore upwards to drain water and dirt from the shaft being sunk above them. Loosing off the icebreaker, Corley held the boat across the tunnel while Wainwright started boring as fast as he could. It only took a few minutes for the smoke and fumes to overcome them both, however, and Wainwright collapsed back into the boat while Corley slipped into the water. The tug driver, meanwhile, had no way of knowing this. Despite this operation having been carried out repeatedly before, no one had thought to tell the tug crew about this part passage. Although Corley had signalled to the driver that they would be joining the train, the fact that no boat was there when the train reached the Dutton side simply told the driver that the icebreaker didn't join the train at all. Returning about half an hour later, the tug slammed into the icebreaker and got stuck. The boaters and the train behind, in an act that perhaps describes the state of the air in the tunnel far better than any other description, immediately all climbed into the back boat and legged out as fast as they could, abandoning the tug and her crew. When a rescue party ventured into the tunnel, they found Corley first, and it was with extreme relief that they found Wainwright and the two tug crew still breathing, albeit barely. Following the inquest, the tug was suspended for over a week while they finished the shafts, and in future the tug driver had to be told exactly how many boats he should have when he reached the other end of the tunnel, and was required to do a head count. The boaters were understandably spooked too, and it was noted that for quite some time afterwards boats would enter the tunnel with legging boards left out, just in case. A number of boatmen refused to let their wives and children remain on the boat during the passage too, making them all get out and walk over the top. The shafts weren't as successful as it had been hoped. Smoke wafted out of each portal and straight up into the tunnel keeper's house, forcing the company to brick up all the windows on that side. Some boaters still legged through in the dead of night, but the presence of the tugs reduced the death toll immensely. Indeed, the only death that really garnered any attention for the next 30 years was when a young boatman lay down on the side bed while they were going through the tunnel and somehow had his clothes catch fire. The tunnel wasn't all darkness apparently either. Another apocryphal story was that one boatwoman actually gave birth in the tunnel, having gone into labour at Barnton but presuming that she had enough time to get to Preston Brook. And another tale that the boatman took advantage of the darkness to get better acquainted with lady friends made in the village, with the tug driver slowing the entire train down for a few pence slipped in his pocket. And on that note we'll finish today's video, but I hope you'll join me for part 3 when we enter into the modern age.